This is Lesson 14.2, the European Voyages of Discovery. How and why did Europeans undertake voyages of expansion? Lots of reasons. And once again, we're still with College Board 1.1, contextualizing Renaissance and discovery. Explain the context in which the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery developed. So we've got that. Europeans explored and settled overseas territories, encountering and interacting with indigenous populations. And European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives to explore overseas territories and establish colonies. And then we've got 1.6 again. Explain the technological factors that facilitated European exploration and expansion from 1450 to 1648. Technology. Advances in navigation, cartography, and military technology enabled Europeans to establish overseas colonies and empires, which means, and I just put this here myself, that Europeans had not only the motivation and the will, they also had the means that technology gave them. And so, explain the motivations for and the effects of European exploration and expansion from 1450 to 1648. European states sought direct access to gold, spices, and luxury goods to enhance personal wealth and state power. And Christianity was a stimulus for exploration as governments and religious authorities sought to spread the faith. And for some, it served as a justification for the subjugation of indigenous civilizations. And then once again, here it is again, one more time, College Board topic 111, causation in the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. It's a simple repetition of 1.1. It's a wrap-up. It comes full circle. Explain the context in which the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery developed. Europeans, like we said, explored and settled overseas territories, encountering and interacting with indigenous populations. And once again, we're saying this, it's a repetition. European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives to explore overseas territories and establish colonies. And so here are our places. We've got the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, Portugal, Spain, and the Caribbean, as we can see, and South America. And some key concepts, the Caravel, the Treaty of Tordesillas, and Ptolemy's Geography. And some key people, Christopher Columbus, there he is. There's Prince Henry the Navigator, Ferdinand Magellan, Vasco da Gama, my favorite, and then Bartolomeo Diaz. And so here's our introduction. Initial voyages of discovery, they were an Iberian thing. Don't forget what Iberia is. It's that peninsula that contains Spain and Portugal. All of Europe was recovering quickly from the Black Death, and new technology, which we will talk about, was improving exploration. And there was a deep desire to spread Christianity, and we'll talk about why. There was also a deep desire to take domination away from the Italians and the Ottomans. And so the changes that the Iberians would bring about were unimaginable. They helped create the modern world, our modern world. And the consequences for Europe and the whole world of what the Iberians were doing and what they were going to pull off were staggering. There were several causes of European expansion. You know, we like the 3 Gs. Everybody loves the 3 Gs, gold, God, and glory. I like to go a little further than that. But here's reason number one. And this is where we talk about spices and their significance. Economic recovery from the Black Death, like I said, was increasing. The population was increasing. And there was an increasing demand for luxury goods from the East. And this was especially true of spices. You can call spices a luxury good. And this is true of spices because of their many uses. The kinds of spices that were in demand included cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, ginger, mace, cloves, etc. Many, many more. Spices had a wide variety of uses. Preserving much needed food for poor populations was one. Adding flavor and variety, anointing oil, incense and perfumes, and many, many others. Look at that. It's a spice cloud with camphor and coriander and mustard and cardamom and cinnamon, saffron, cloves, nutmeg, cumin, all kinds of stuff. Ooh, anise if you like licorice. I don't. But what is the big deal about spices? Why go halfway around the whole planet and put your life in your hands and all that just to make your food taste a little better? Well, let's get into that. Europe and spices. Spices were held in near mystical reverence by Europeans. People believed that spices possessed rare beneficial qualities, and the European demand for spices was insatiable. Spices were thought to have a religious origin. It was thought that the true source of spices was like the Garden of Eden. The true source of spices was unknown to Europeans. And people thought that if you were to trace the origin of spices and gems to their ultimate source, you would track them down to the Garden of Eden. You would wind up in the Garden of Eden. The uses for spices were practically unlimited. Some increased the appetite in spite of all the bland European food. Some disguised the taste of old meat. Some countered nausea from bad drinking water. Some were balms for soothing and healing. Camphor was thought to have more virtues than was possible to count. Cardamom had lots of varied effects. Cloves were great for the liver and the heart and coughs. Ginger was great as a medicine and on food. Nutmeg and mace prevented vomiting and steadied the heart. Spices could even be used as currency. They could be used to pay tribute to religious authorities. In some countries, they could be used to pay taxes. But the most valuable spice of all was pepper. Dear as pepper was a popular term in France. Oh, you're dear as pepper. A serf could buy his freedom with 1 pound of pepper. It could be used for insect stings. It made a great ointment. It could be used to fight colds. And it could be used, of course, to make food taste better. But the most important use of pepper was for the preserving of meat. And here is why. Life in Europe, and especially in Portugal, was extremely harsh. Superstition, brutality, disease, and poverty all shortened the lives of millions of people. Winters were long and hard and full of sickness and death. And feed for animals was insufficient to get those animals through the winter. So you had to kill and eat your excess animals in the fall because you did not have enough feed to keep them all alive. So as a result of that, you ate them all in the fall. They're done. So people's winter diet lacked nutrition. A declining population was a huge threat for any lord, any nobleman, any aristocrat. And if you are a landed nobleman, you needed healthy humans around to work the land, to pay the taxes, to serve in the army. And war and disease and starvation took a massive toll on the population. Also, a population that suffers this much pressure becomes uneasy and restless. Look at that picture. You have to find a way to feed these people, or very bad things will happen. Riots and revolts and rebellions, and this is especially true in the towns. And importing grain to feed all of these people could be a huge drain on a country's economy. And all of these critical problems that I just mentioned that a nation faced could be greatly reduced by one thing, and that was pepper. Pepper could be used to preserve meat far into the winter months. And if you could do that, then people could actually have meat to eat in the winter. And more meat meant a larger, healthier, stronger, more contented population. Reason number 2 for all of this exploration: religious fervor, especially against the Ottomans. Remember the Ottomans way over in the east? The Ottomans were extremely aggressive and frightening. We'll talk about the Ottomans many times over this course. They caused a tremendous feeling of uncertainty and insecurity. Spain, especially, had a crusading response to the Ottomans. Now, of course, the Ottomans, Spain is as far away from the seat of Ottoman power as you get, but they still had the Ottomans quite close. And one response to the Ottoman threat was religious intolerance, just like we saw in Lesson 12.5. Combined Christian, Islamic, and Jewish populations had managed a very fragile and often violently disrupted coexistence for centuries. And as we talked about in 12.5, Ferdinand and Isabella wanted one religion in Spain. They didn't want three. And the Reconquista had made it possible to totally destroy the Islamic Moors and expel the Jews from Spain. Remember that? And the Moors and the Ottomans, well, they had little shared experience. We talked about that, but so what? They were different, and infidels were infidels. And to be fair, violent jihad was a value that both the Ottomans and the Moors shared, which is to say that there was a very long history of intense warfare and competition between the Moors and the Christians in Spain. To the Spanish, the Reconquista felt like a strong affirmative Christian statement. Christianity is alive and well in Europe. Also, don't forget the search for Prester John that we talked about. Could this mysterious Prester John be a potential ally against the Ottoman Empire? And if he was, he'd have to be found first. And this religious crusade also had an economic aspect to it. That Mediterranean Turkish lake that I showed you on one of our maps in 12.5, it had become a dangerous place to be. Dangerous for travel, dangerous for trade, dangerous for investment, and getting around the Turks would be an economic victory for Christianity. Ferdinand and Isabella needed to unify Spain. They rallied their two kingdoms, remember Castile and Aragon, around Catholic Christianity. As we know, Ferdinand and Isabella completed the centuries-old Reconquista, and there's a big map of it right there. Number 3 reason, there was ongoing curiosity about the physical universe, and this was highly influenced by the Renaissance. The educated of Europe often read books about travelers. Columbus was naturally curious, and he had copies of both of these two books with him on his 1492 voyage, the Travels of Sir John Mandeville and the Travels of Marco Polo. Reason number 4, Spanish monarchs were supporting foreign ventures because they were looking for opportunities for economic growth. Reason number 5, economic opportunities for common people at home were limited and limiting. Sailors received a very modest salary. There was poverty at home. The poor and the orphaned were often placed on ships to get rid of them. And sailors' wives struggled to feed their families while their husbands were away. Reason number 6, merchant and monarch financing. Merchants and monarchs often set the aims of the mission that they were financing. They didn't just let you go anywhere. They often gave the explorer detailed written instructions. The crown could give an explorer an official endorsement. And as you can see, there's Columbus right there kneeling before Ferdinand and Isabella. Technology and the rise of exploration. Significant developments in shipbuilding made exploration easier. And the most important development, the most important piece of technology was the Caravel. The Caravel was a ship, and it was small and highly nimble. And it had a lantine sail, like a triangular sail that was kind of at an angle, and that made it better for tacking. It also had a rear rudder, and that made it more maneuverable. Previous ships like galleys, they had their rudder right in the middle of the hull. Also, the Caravel had an ellipsoidal hull, and that made it steadier in rough seas. It also had a tougher scaffolded hull frame. And it needed far less crew because there were no oars, so there were no rowers to feed. It depended entirely upon wind power for its propulsion. And so the Caravel had a lot of updated features. The Mediterranean galley versus the smaller but more seaworthy Caravel. You've got a galley up on top with all of these oars on it. The galley was meant for rowing, whereas the Caravel was designed to capture even the slightest breeze. Ptolemy's Geography. In 1486, this is the 1486 Catalan Map, and it's based upon Ptolemy's ancient work, Geography. And it contained the most advanced geographical knowledge of its day. Notice, it's got no Western Hemisphere. And if you look at Africa, there's no bottom end to the African continent. Nobody knew how far down that was. Nobody had seen it. Nobody even knew if Africa had a bottom to it. Here's another piece of technology, the magnetic compass and the Astrolabe. The magnetic compass was a Chinese invention. It enabled you to find your direction wherever in the world you were. The Astrolabe was a Middle Eastern invention, and the Astrolabe enabled you to find your latitudinal position wherever you were. Now, finding your longitudinal position, how far east or west you were, that was still going to be a problem for a long time because you couldn't depend on the stars to find that. But both of these things, the compass and the Astrolabe, made long-distance navigation much easier. Gunpowder and the stern-post rudder, advances in cartography, drew on the Judeo-Arabic mathematical tradition. So the beginning of Portuguese expansion, Prince Henry of Portugal, he lived from 1394 to 1460. Who would have thought that a tiny, impoverished nation of about 1 million people would establish a world trading empire? Prince Henry was not known as the Navigator until the 19th century, and we're actually going to find out why. His people knew him as the Infant, and that was an honorific. That was a word of endearment. And he was called the Infant because he was the youngest of 3 royal sons. He was the 3rd son of the king. But he was very close to his 2 older brothers. These 3 brothers made a really good, tight team. And Prince Henry was a celebrated military commander. He was the head of the Military Order of Christ, and that was a position that he used to draw investments and men for his voyages. And Henry commanded the conquest of the Muslim city of Ceuta in 1415, and Ceuta was in northwest Africa on the coast. It was a very risky operation, but it won Prince Henry great fame for its success. And Prince Henry pushed for the colonization of the recently discovered Azores, way out in the Atlantic Ocean, and also the island of Madeira, which had sugar plantations on it. So Henry established the first Portuguese African commercial settlement at Arguin in 1443. And Henry established fortified gold trading posts on the Guinea coast. And by the year 1500, that was 40 years after he was dead, Portugal controlled the gold trade from Africa to Europe. And unlike the Spanish, the Portuguese did not actually colonize in Africa. They didn't build large settlements and, push lots and lots of people out there. They made no attempts to control Africa politically or culturally. But the most important thing that Prince Henry the Navigator did was organize exploration of the African coastline. He founded a school to train navigators. Vasco da Gama went there. Columbus went there. And Prince Henry sent expedition after expedition down the coast of Africa, and he methodically and meticulously collected data about African waters. Things like wind and currents and waters and people and diseases and climate, weather, coastline, even barnacles, etc. That was a very important study because You could wind up in certain waters where barnacles would eat your hull before you even knew it, and you didn't have a ship. So every successive ship went a little bit further and was built a little bit better. So they were getting a little farther and a little better every time. So why was Prince Henry so motivated to do this? Well, of course, there was prosperity for Portugal in terms of gold, slaves, spice, and expansion. And then there was the religious reasons. He wanted to outflank the Ottomans, and he wanted to bring the African heathen to Christianity, supposedly. And we're going to talk about his dark side very soon. European slavery. Let's look at the background here. There's a long-standing narrative out there that historians are working hard to dispel. You've heard the narrative, though you might not know its name. And that narrative can be called the Christian Amelioration narrative. And it goes like this. This will sound familiar. This narrative about European slavery is, number one, Christianity and slavery are incompatible. And so therefore, when the ancient Roman Empire became Christian back in the 300s, slavery in Europe gradually disappeared as Christian principles permeated European society and its institutions. And those Europeans who did own slaves, well, they owned them because they were corrupt and they were sinful and they were behind their own times and they were not fully Christian. Finally, the supposed reemergence of slavery that came along with the discovery, conquest, and settlement of the New World was a reversal and a setback on Europe's steady path toward being a more civilized and compassionate society. Perhaps all of that sounds about right. Perhaps all of that feels familiar, except that almost all of it is inaccurate. 19th century abolitionists, and God bless them, they were doing the right thing. Their heart was in the right place. But they pushed this narrative to make abolitionism sound more appealing to people. In the 1260s, Byzantine emperors granted Venice, Genoa, and the Mamluk Kingdom commercial trading privileges in the Black Sea. And there's a map right here, and it's not labeled very well. The seas aren't labeled, lots of cities on it, but that kind of big sea right there on the upper right, that's the Black Sea. And then, of course, that really big one down below, that's the Mediterranean. And so merchants from these sea powers, Venice and Genoa, and you can see those two way over on the upper left, and the Mamluk Kingdom, that's down on the lower right. These sea powers set up trading colonies in the Black Sea. And all three of these powers participated in the Black Sea slave trade as both competitors and partners. The slaves that they took were white and often Christian. Europe had a strong preference for women who could serve as domestic and sexual servants, and the Mamluks down in Egypt had a strong preference for men who could serve in their slave army. Slaves who fought in the Mamluk slave army could be richly rewarded for their service, including great power. And all of this is in a book called That Most Precious Merchandise by Hannah Barker. But it's an extremely expensive book, even downloaded on your Kindle. So hopefully, if you want to read that, the price will go down soon. Around 1475, the Ottoman Empire shut down these trading colonies, and they cut these traders out of the Black Sea and took the Black Sea slave trade for themselves. And according to Ibram X. Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, where I'm getting a lot of this information from, Black Sea communities were also putting up fortresses to defend themselves from slave traders. But either way, the main thing is that the supply of white Christian slaves was drying up, just as the supply of African non-Christian slaves was expanding. And this started to cause a shift in how Europeans saw the natural slave in their minds. And that shift went from being, any color towards being black. All over the Mediterranean, both Christians and Muslims shared some basic assumptions about slavery throughout the Middle Ages. It was considered perfectly legal. Of course it was. It was perfectly normal and socially acceptable. Anybody could become a slave simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. For example, being captured by pirates or having your town raided. And finally, the assumption was that slavery was based on religious difference. Christians weren't supposed to enslave other Christians. Muslims weren't supposed to enslave other Muslims. Now that religious assumption, that's the weakest link in the chain right there of this whole kind of assumptive world they're building. Most people understood that if your enslavement was permanent, in other words, if you weren't going to be ransomed and no rescue was coming, then you were expected to convert to the religion of your master. And it was also understood that you weren't going to be set free when you did convert. Some people argued that Christians should enslave other Christians. They argued that this would keep Christians from having to convert to Islam. Some argued that sea traders like the Genoese and the Venetians, who were oftentimes giving transport service to the Mamluks, should stop supplying slaves to the Mamluks. This was just making the Mamluk kingdom's slave army stronger. So, since the religion thing was pretty fluid, there had to be other categories tied with religion that could keep you enslaved. Otherwise, you could just convert and then sue for your freedom and walk away. But these categories were language and race. These were two things you could not convert as easily as you could your religion. The emergence of racist ideas. And, let me just say about this. This is a big issue today. According to Kendi's book, if you think about it, the reason that there is racial hatred and racial animosity and racial injustice and inequality is because of racist ideas. If we weren't walking around with racist ideas in our heads, there would be no racial hatred. Wouldn't exist. And so, you can get duped into people who want to push racist ideas, who are pushing it for their own gain. And that's why this section is here. In 1452, Gomez Llanes de Zurara was commissioned to write a biography of Prince Henry of Portugal. And this work was commissioned by Prince Henry himself. Prince Henry was the book's principal source of information. And the book was called The Chronicles of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea. It was the first European book on Africa in the modern era. It was the first defense of African slave trading. And it covered Portugal's expeditions and discoveries from 1434 to 1448. Zurara's purpose was to preserve history, but Zurara's other purpose was to glorify Prince Henry the Navigator. And in order to do that, Zurara would have to spin Henry's racist policies into something heroic and charitable. In the Chronicles of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, Gomez Llanes de Zurara told the story of the first big slave auction in Portugal in August of 1444. 200 captives were auctioned in a huge spectacle. And upon this auction, Portugal had become an emerging force among all the important slave traders. Portugal now joined Genoa and Venice and the Spanish kingdoms by going further than anyone else to discover and capture more slaves. Portugal had an image advantage that these other slave trading nations did not have. Because, as we said before, anyone in the Mediterranean could be a slave. And because many European slaves were already Christians when they were enslaved, the Genoese and the Venetians and the Mamluk kingdom could not make the claim that they were saving souls of their captives. However, Portugal was getting their captives from an entirely different place. The 200 captive people that Zurara described in his book had been captured from different parts of Africa, and the shades of their skin varied widely, but Zurara saw them all as one people for two reasons. Number one, he said they were all barbarians. He said, and I'm quoting, they lived like beasts, without reason and without any understanding of good. And his second reason he saw them as all one people was he said they were all in need of religious salvation. Zurara argued that for these reasons, their lives as slaves in Portugal would be better than their lives in Africa had been. And according to Zurara's account, Prince Henry presided over this auction and presided over the spectacle himself. And the captives were crying and groaning, but Prince Henry had the satisfaction of knowing that their souls would be saved. And Zurara convinced readers and popes and the European world through his writing that Portugal did not engage in the slave trade for the money. They engaged in it to bring people to salvation. And Zurara did not mention that Prince Henry became fabulously wealthy from Portugal's emerging slave trade. In 1466, 6 years after Prince Henry's death, the Portuguese king was making more money selling captives to foreigners than from all the taxes collected from the entire kingdom of Portugal. Now, that's less than it sounds like. It sounds astronomical. But keep in mind, Portugal was still one of the smallest and poorest countries in Europe, so the tax revenue wasn't that much. And this was all still many years before Portugal would have anything like the vast trading empire that it was going to have. Zurara's manuscripts were read by the royal court, by scholars, by investors, sea captains throughout Spain and Portugal. And the racist ideas in the Chronicles of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea expanded as the slave trade expanded. In fact, these ideas went far beyond the actual manuscript. A whole new network of forts and agents and financiers and ships and crews and slave traders and explorers circulated the ideas in this book. Now, here's the interesting thing. Complete copies of Zurara's book completely disappeared for almost 300 years. Now, the early abolitionist Bartolomeo de las Casas, who we will study in detail in a very soon lesson in 1405, actually, claimed to have a copy in the 1540s. But nevertheless, the ideas expressed in the book, those ideas did not fade at all. Instead, they actually got stronger. And in the year 1839, a perfectly preserved, a pristine copy of Zurara's book was rediscovered in France. And it is from this one copy that we got this image of Prince Henry the Navigator that was taught to us in school. He's taught up to this point as this ingenious, intrepid Christian missionary hero, rather than as the man who became rich off of human exploitation and human suffering, justified by racist ideas. Well, the first really huge payoff of Henry the Navigator's efforts was the successful mission of Bartolomeo Diaz, and this was long after Henry's death. Diaz was a Portuguese navigator, and in 1487 he took 2 of those caravels that we talked about and 1 support ship on an all-out get there or die trying effort to find the southern tip of Africa, and he was determined not to turn around before succeeding. And keep in mind, at this point, they didn't even know if there was a southern tip of Africa. For all they knew, Africa went all the way down through the Antarctic and back up. So this was an extremely tough journey. And Diaz found the bottom of Africa in the year 1488. He was the first European to reach the Indian Ocean this way. And Diaz wanted to go farther, but his officers refused, arguing that, hey, they had accomplished their mission and it was more important to take this amazing news back home than to risk death in unknown waters. I mean, if we just discovered something amazing. We have found the tip of Africa. If we die before getting home, they will never know. So Diaz called the tip of Africa the Cape of Good Hope. I just love this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures. It's a picture of Diaz looking out at the Indian Ocean, wishing that he could just keep going. And behind Diaz, what his men are doing right there is they are erecting the customary stone column with a cross on it to mark for people who are coming after them where they had been. The Portuguese sat on this incredible secret, the secret that they had found their way around Africa to the Indian Ocean for several years. It was almost as if, they were just too exhausted and too overwhelmed by the implications of what they had discovered to act upon it. Then, in 1492, Christopher Columbus, of all people, showed up in Lisbon Harbor in Portugal aboard his one remaining caravel, the Nina. Columbus was escaping a storm that he had encountered in the Atlantic Ocean. Columbus was on his way back to Spain from an amazing voyage of discovery of his own. You may have heard of it. The King of Portugal, John II, sent one of his top officials out into the harbor to Columbus's ship to find out who the captain of this ship was and where it had been and where it was going, etc. And that top official was none other than Bartolomeo Diaz himself. They didn't know where Columbus had been, but from what they saw on his ship, it was very clear to the Portuguese that Columbus had been to some previously unknown, fantastical place. And King John II and Bartolomeo Diaz both, they already knew Columbus personally. Columbus had spent years in Portugal trying to convince King John II to endorse the voyage that he had just made on behalf of Spain. And that's when the Portuguese decided that they had better make the most of Diaz's discovery before somebody else did. It was time to send a brave explorer all the way around the southern tip of Africa and all the way to India. And their man was Vasco da Gama. He was, of course, a Portuguese nobleman, and he left Portugal on July 8th, 1497, with 4 ships, 170 men. He was gone for 2 years and 4 days. He rounded Diaz's Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, and then he went on. And there is a terrific book about Vasco da Gama's voyage, if you're into that sort of thing. It's called Unknown Seas by Ronald Watkins. I highly recommend it. Well, then da Gama and his men had to deal, lie, trick, and often fight their way up the East African coast against the various local peoples and cities, large cities there on that coast that they encountered. Muslim Indian Ocean traders knew exactly what they were seeing as soon as they saw European ships sailing up the African coast. They knew that they were seeing a threat to their trade monopoly. And da Gama's expedition made it to Calicut, India on May the 20th, 1498. In India, da Gama and his men traded whatever they could for as much spice as they could get their hands on. They had very little gold to trade with. Historians are not sure why, which was just about the only thing that Indian merchants wanted, so they really had to scramble. And Vasco da Gama and his men spent months in India learning as much about Indian trade and culture as they possibly could. Da Gama finally got back to Portugal on August 29th, 1499, with 2 ships. One ship got back on July 10th. and a lot less men than his original 170. But he had enough spice on his ship to cover the entire cost of the voyage. The Portuguese public was astonished. They thought for sure that da Gama and all his men were long dead. And so Vasco da Gama became a national hero. And the following year, the Portuguese mounted this huge expedition to India with practically every ship they had, whether it was seaworthy or not. Vasco da Gama's amazing achievement was as big a deal as landing on the moon today. Vasco da Gama proved that direct trade with the East was possible via the Cape route around Africa. The prices of spice in Europe went down to about a fifth of what they had been before. Da Gama established the foundation for a Portuguese world trading empire. And Portugal had great advantages regarding shipbuilding, weapons, and navigation. And they established trading forts all along the African coast. And many of these were actually captured Muslim forts. Why build a new fortress when you can simply seize one that's already been built? Tremendous wealth and power came to the tiny country of Portugal, but they never quite got a monopoly on the Indian Ocean trade network because other European countries, especially the Dutch Republic, noticed the achievement. You could not notice it. And soon, the competition for colonial power was on. Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was an Italian explorer living at first in Portugal, then he moved to Spain. And for a long time, Columbus had been thinking about reaching Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. Since the planet is round, this idea should work in theory. And in fact, the Vikings, as you may know, had already sailed across the Atlantic and discovered America. They had landed at Newfoundland. Most historians believe that Columbus did not know about the Vikings' previous discovery. There's been some debate about that. Columbus's idea was not an original idea. Other explorers had tried sailing west across the Atlantic, but they'd always turned back around before reaching anything because they were afraid of running out of food and running out of fresh water. But Columbus was convinced that if you could just be bold enough and brave enough and gutsy enough to keep going, you would reach Asia before your supplies ran out. However, Columbus's view of the earth was extremely flawed, and I'll show you. This is what Columbus thought the earth looked like. Of course, Columbus didn't know about America, and he didn't know about the Pacific Ocean. Columbus believed that Japan lay 1,500 miles off the coast of Asia. And on this map, you can see where England is, you can see where Spain is, there's Africa, you can see the Canary Islands, and you can see this thing called Sipangu. Well, that's Japan, right? And then there's Asia right there. Columbus calculated that the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan was about 2,400 miles. Well, Columbus also had a lifelong fascination for biblical texts and biblical prophecies. And in the book of 2nd Esdras 6:42, Columbus read this verse, "On the third day you commanded the waters to be gathered together in a seventh part of the earth, but you made the 6 parts dry." Now, Columbus took this verse to mean that there can't be that much more undiscovered ocean out there because the surface of the earth is only 1/7 covered by water, so the Atlantic must be pretty narrow. And by the way, this book of 2nd Esdras, you're not going to find this book or this verse in your Bible at home because both the Catholic and Protestant churches reject the book of 2nd Esdras as being inspired. No one in Europe knew about America or the Pacific Ocean. But European experts already had a very accurate idea of how big the earth was, and they also knew that Japan was more like 10,600 miles from the Canary Islands, not 2,400. So no ship could make it that far. You would run out of food and water and die before you got there. They tried to tell that to Columbus, but you couldn't tell Columbus anything. The two Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, finally funded Columbus's mission. They didn't think Columbus would reach Asia, but they hoped that perhaps Columbus might find something profitable somewhere out there. And besides their neighbors, the Portuguese were already aggressively exploring the South Atlantic and Africa. Columbus left Spain with 3 well-equipped caravels and a magnetic compass and an astrolabe and a piece of equipment called a quadrant. None of Columbus's caravels was called the Mayflower. No. Yes, I've had lots of 10th grade students who thought that. Yes, they were actually called the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. During the voyage, Columbus routinely lied to his men every day about how far they were traveling so that they would not freak out and insist on turning back. And Columbus discovered the Americas finally in 1492, as you know, and as you know, the world has never been the same since. Here is a wonderful painting of an emergency operation. What do you think is afflicting the crew? Here's some people bringing just baskets and baskets of oranges up to the ship. What do you think is afflicting this crew? Columbus landed in the Bahamas in San Salvador. And his second voyage, he enslaved the people of Hispaniola and established settlers in these new territories. And there were revolts against Columbus. Columbus eventually became the governor of Hispaniola. He was not a good governor. And a revolt broke out against Columbus and his brother. And the Spanish government stepped in and took over the colony and arrested Columbus and his brother. And it was while Columbus was sitting in prison at the lowest point in his life that he learned that Vasco da Gama had sailed to India. Columbus believed and insisted to his dying day, which was in 1506, that he had reached Asia. He believed that he had discovered small islands off the coast of Asia. He never had any idea of what he truly had accomplished. Columbus sailed to America a total of 4 times, and Columbus opened the way for further European exploration and eventual colonization of the Americas. So here's the big question that students always love to ask. They always think their teachers want to avoid this question. And the question is this. You're thinking it. Did Columbus actually discover America? What's your perspective? Well, that really depends on who you ask. If you asked somebody from the old world, and when we say old world, we mean Europe, Asia, and Africa, they would say, yes, he did. They hadn't known about America before Columbus's voyage, and therefore Columbus discovered it for them. Now, if you ask somebody from the New World, that's North America and South America, they would say, no. Columbus did not discover America. 1/3 of the Earth's population was already living in the Americas. Their ancestors had discovered America thousands of years before Columbus did, and they weren't lost. The New World was their old world. They didn't need to be discovered. They were doing just fine before Columbus showed up. And if you ask Christopher Columbus himself, he would have said, no, he did not discover any new continent. Columbus did not want to believe that he had discovered a vast, previously unknown world. In Columbus's mind, discovering a new continent instead of discovering a way to Asia meant that he was a failure, a loser, a fool, and a nobody. Columbus didn't want to be a failure, so he stubbornly insisted until the day he died that he had found a direct route to Asia. And that is why America is named after someone else and not him. Vasco da Gama is reported to have once said about his fantastic voyage to India, "We didn't just discover India, India also discovered us." And you can apply that quote to the question of whether or not Columbus discovered America. Columbus didn't just discover America, America also discovered Europe and Asia and Africa. Spain, quote, discovers the Pacific early. Amerigo Vespucci, who lived from 1454 to 1512, was the guy whose name is used for America. He was a Florentine from Florence. He was an explorer, and he realized that Columbus had discovered a mundus novus. And Vespucci coined the phrase mundus novus, and that's Latin. In English, it means new world. And this is why America is named after Amerigo Vespucci. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494. By 1494, after Columbus's discovery, Portugal and Spain realized that they needed to stay out of each other's way in the exploration and conquest business. And with the Pope's help, Spain and Portugal were both Catholic countries, so they needed the Pope in on this. They signed several treaties, and the most famous of these treaties was the Treaty of Tordesillas. In the Treaty of Tordesillas, Spain and Portugal, these two tiny countries, divided the entire planet in half between just the two of them. An imaginary line was drawn down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and at the time, they still had very little idea of how much was actually out there. But this treaty needed to be in place now. And so Spain would get anything that might be discovered west of that line, and Portugal would get anything that might be discovered east of that line. No other nations were recognized in the treaty. But that was okay because other nations just ignored the treaty. But Brazil wound up on the Portuguese side of the line that they drew when Pedro Alvares Cabral accidentally hit it in the year 1500. There he is hitting it. See, look at this map. See, when this treaty was made, they had no idea that South America extended that far east. So they had no idea that this portion, a rather large portion of South America, would wind up on the Portuguese side of the treaty line. Ferdinand Magellan lived from about 1480 to 1521. Portugal was getting rich out of their end of the Treaty of Tordesillas. And meanwhile, Spain was making fairly lame profits from its few tiny little islands. And so Spain, and we say Spain, actually Emperor Charles V, decided to try to find Asia again. And the man chosen for the mission was Ferdinand Magellan. He was Portuguese, actually, but he was working for Spain. He had fallen out of favor with the Portuguese king, and now he was under Spain's employment. And Ferdinand Magellan got 5 ships and 270 men. And this blurry thing is his route, 1519 to 1522. Magellan found his way to the Pacific through the Straits of Magellan at the bottom of South America, and he gave the Pacific its name. He also had to deal with an attempted mutiny during this time. Magellan crossed the Pacific in 98 days. Totally ran out of food and water. His men ate rats and sawdust just to stay alive. And they finally arrived in the Philippines and named it after the king, Philip II. And Magellan was killed in a skirmish with natives in the Philippines. And for the remainder of the crew, the rest of the way home was really not about discovering anything new because they knew where they were, but really about avoiding Portuguese authorities because now they were in violation of the Treaty of Tordesillas. They weren't supposed to be in the Indian Ocean. So the mission's 2 remaining ships left the Philippines. One ship, the Trinidad, sprang a leak at a port in Portuguese-held Indonesia, and 52 sailors stayed behind with it, hoping to repair it. The Trinidad eventually did make it back home. San Sebastian Elcano and 17 other crew members took the last ship, the Victoria, all the way home to Spain from there. And they had enough spice aboard that ship to make a slight profit on the voyage. So what did the Spanish learn from Magellan's expedition? Well, they learned how huge the Pacific was. For one thing, getting to Asia by heading west was just not practical. And if they wanted the kind of wealth that the Portuguese were getting, they needed to find it in the Mundus Novus. They needed to find it in the New World and not in Asia. Early exploration by Northern European powers. The English and French searched for a northwest passage to the Indies. And there were futile voyages of Newfoundland and Canada. England had initial failures. Genoese Captain John Cabot, working for England, mapped Newfoundland and the New England coast. And Martin Frobisher explored around Canada. France also had initial failures. Jacques Cartier found the St. Lawrence River, and he got to where present-day Montreal is, and he also managed to discover very plentiful furs and fishing.